The Hebrews created history as we know it.
You don't get away with anything. And so you might think you can bend the fabric of reality and that you can treat people instrumentally and that you can bow to the tyrant and violate your conscience without cost. You will pay the piper. It's going to call you out of that slavery into freedom, even if that pulls you into the desert.
And we're going to see that there's something else going on here that is far more cosmic and deeper than what you can imagine.
The highest ethical spirit to which we're beholden is presented precisely as that spirit that allies itself with the cause of freedom against tyranny. And
yes,
there
exactly.
Is that hope.
I want villains to get punished.
But do you want the villains to learn before they have to pay the ultimate price?
That's such a Christian question.
For a long time, on the self-esteem front, there was this idea that positive affirmations for children were the way to self-esteem. All that false praise, that devaluation of the currency of reward, that overgeneralization of insistence upon your child's singular wonderfulness at the expense of other people, it didn't improve self-esteem. What it did was inflate narcissism. And so all this idiot insistence on self-esteem through continual affirmation, you produce this increase in self-centered narcissism, and you make kids more isolated and miserable and lonely than they would have otherwise had to be.
When I worked with parents, it was constantly, a child would come home and say, somebody kicked me in the playground. And the first question from the parent was not, so what did you do about it or what happened, but, and how did that make you feel? And what it does is it gives power to feelings above actions. And so you get a child who, then the child stops and thinks, well, how did I feel about it? And it's usually, sad or angry or happy. It's this sort of very limited range of feeling words. If we bring that back every time to the child's feelings, then the child is growing up thinking, my feelings are the most important thing.
Hello, everyone watching or listening on YouTube or Associated Podcast or on the Daily Wire Plus platform. I have the privilege today of speaking to Stephanie Davies-Arai. She is a decorated author and the founder, as well as the director of Transgender Trend, a UK-based organization that has been perpetually under fire by leftist activists simply for advocating for evidence-based healthcare when it comes to gender dysphoric children. She's also the author of Communicating with Kids, book published in 2015. Based on her background training teachers and providing parental support, Davies-Arai is also notable for being an intervener in the High Court during the landmark case Bell versus Tavistock, which concluded that persons under 18 cannot consent to puberty blockers. So, Stephanie, I was reading your book today, 2015 book, Communicating with Children, and I thought maybe I could playfully put you on the spot. In my first book, 12 Rules for Life, my first popular book, I have a chapter entitled, Don't Let Your Children Do Anything That Makes You Dislike Them. And so what I thought I'd ask you, given that you wrote this book detailing out different means of communicating with children, developing a philosophy of communication with children. I'm kind of wondering what you think of that rule. How does that strike you? Don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them.
I love that you started with that, because that's the bit in your book which I've read that jumped out at me, because that's what I say to parents. You of course you love your children to bits, you die for them, but do you like them? Because that's really important in day-to-day living. But the other thing I say is that it's not only important that you like your own kids, but that other parents do and other people outside, because otherwise your kids are going to have a really hard time, and you're not going to be doing them a favour if you bring them up to be unpopular with other kids' parents, because they're going to depend on them. So,
okay, so let me outline a few ideas for you, and you tell me, criticize away or agree as you see fit. So I think we know there's a large literature indicating that it's better for children to have two parents. And I think the reason for that, this is my reasoning for it, there's a variety of reasons. Obviously, raising children and working is very difficult. So being able to split the labor is a way of perhaps not being entirely exhausted when you have small children. But I think there's something else going on too, which is more, it's akin in some sense to the reason that there's sexual differentiation at a biological level. So there's sexual differentiation because it's useful to bring together two disparate creatures to produce a new variant. But I also think it's true on the personality front. So if you have a nicely organized marriage, you're going to have your bits of insanity and your partner's going to have their bits of insanity. But if you can form a joint union, then I believe you can produce something approximating one sane person. And that person is sane, that joint person is sane, not so much because they're sane psychologically, but because they're an analog of the broader social world. So, and I'm saying that for a specific reason. So then the theory would be, if your children are acting in a way that both of you find displeasing, if you're honest, then the probability that other people will find that displeasing is extremely high, because you at least love your children, whereas other people, they might be willing to give them a chance, but they're not going to die for them. And so if you accept the additional hypothesis that the primary role of a parent is to prepare their children for what would you say, welcome acceptance into the broader social world, then you have a moral obligation to guide your children in some sense in accordance with your own joint feelings. If the two of you find your child's behavior unacceptable, you're morally obligated to let the child know, because that is not going to translate well to other children, to other children's parents, to teachers, to any situations in public. And then your child's going to have a miserable time of it. And I think the research literature indicates that very clearly.
Yeah, and I think, you're right in the sense that the children need the male and the female, the masculine and the feminine, but that can be achieved in other ways. I've worked with all kinds of families. So my work is about creating the optimum situation for families, no matter what whether they're married or what kind of family situation they're in. So I would agree, and particularly that children need strong role models of the opposite sex and the same sex. So, if it's a single parent family, for example, to find those role models that are close family members, because or very good friends of the family, that it has to be a close relationship. I mean, teachers as well, but there are other adults who can fill that gap, and that is something that I think is very important, that gap is filled if the family isn't that male-female unit of marriage that is the traditional unit.
Right, because the children have to learn, okay, so there's two elements there. So you bring a mother and a father together, and the child gets the benefit of their joint personality, right? The fact that they've got two people to hit against, and hopefully that makes one sane person. But the socialization rules for being feminine and the socialization rules for being masculine aren't identical. And so that's part of the reason why it's necessary to have those contrasexual role models at hand. And at hand does mean something like making a relationship with, because the other thing we know about children is, though they can establish multiple deep relationships with people, so they can actually stand multiple caregivers, but they don't really like a lot of change in their caregivers. They don't like relationships once they're established to be decimated, let's say. Well, neither do adults, but it's even more the case for children. And so, yeah, it's harder for a single parent for someone who's running a single parent family to fill that diversity of personality to solve that problem, but also to provide the contrasexual role model. So,
I agree. I mean, I think that consistency is really important for children, and it's fractured in so many ways now in society because if people move around more, people don't tend to stay in those units or those extended family groups in one area. So we have more and more challenges today in bringing up children, and parents face, well, I'm sure you're aware, other challenges in terms of online life, the internet, influences from outside. So yes, that to try and create that consistency for children in their relationships, in their close family relationships, I think is one of the things that's very important. Having said that, I mean, there are all sorts of situations that are not optimum for children, and children are robust. So, you can look at, in our Western society, for example, to remember the fact that our children are, generally very privileged compared to other parts of the world. And so we can get, I think, too concerned about what the negative aspects of our society are, and forget the fact that children are generally robust. They are programmed to survive and to get on. And so we shouldn't be too careful or too worried about the kind of disadvantages they face in sort of a Western society where they have many advantages.
Yes, well, you talk about the fact that parents now exist in what you described as a post-Freudian world. And so there was this idea based on I would say, an oversimplified reading of Freud that all psychological problems that adults suffer from are a consequence of trauma, often associated with poor parenting in childhood. And first of all, no, because there's lots of reasons to have psychological distress as an adult that have nothing to do with your parents. I mean, as the existential psychotherapists pointed out very clearly in the 50s, just the catastrophes associated with being alive are sufficient to cause people a substantial amount of depression and anxiety and hopelessness. So it doesn't have to be all bad parenting. And secondly, the extremes of terrible parenting that Freud noted aren't really, I wouldn't say they're uncommon, but they're not typical. So Freud was particularly concerned with Oedipal parenting, and that would be, well, I suppose the modern equivalent of that is something like helicopter parenting, is the potential damage done by someone who cares so much for their children that they're completely unable to give them any autonomy whatsoever. But I think it's useful for parents to know that, as you just pointed out, that children are quite robust and they can adapt to a variety of circumstances. And also that what you're trying to do with your children is actually have a relationship with them. And one of the things that characterizes robust human relationships is that they can actually stay intact across a wide variety of emotional scenarios. Sometimes people in my clients used to wonder, for example, if they should ever fight in front of their children. And my response to that always was, it's not whether or not you fight, it's whether or not you reconcile. And so what you want to do is model for your children the fact that there's going to be conflict about very important and difficult issues, some of those interpersonal, but some of them just practical, that conflict is actually going to produce a fair bit of emotion, some of which might be negative and even rather intense, but that those things can be negotiated through and the relationship can come back together. We know, for example, even by studying our close primate relatives, that chimpanzees, that the males, for example, are extremely fractious in their interpersonal interactions, but they're also, the sophisticated ones are also extremely good at reconciling and peacemaking. And so, well, the point of all this is that your children are perfectly capable of adapting to a wide range of emotional events, positive and negative. And what you want to help them understand is that the relationship you have with them and with each other, if you're married, is of the sort that's going to be able to withstand the full range of emotional expression without breaking apart. And so you don't have to worry about them being fragile. And you don't have to worry in some sense even about making mistakes with them, as long as you're doing that in the same way you would do that with someone with whom you really want to maintain a long-term relationship.
It's a very rare married couple who don't fight, who don't ever fight and don't ever. And one of the things that I think is important, as you say, that children may see you fight, and of course by that I don't mean, you know, hugely aggressive, throwing things or beating a partner up, but the normal kind of arguments and fights and that a couple would get into. If the children observe that, then I think you're right that it's important that they also see the making up. But they also learn that you're not perfect, that conflict exists and that people resolve it and that it doesn't destroy you. So I think that is really important.
Right.
The other thing is about anger and conflict and argument is, as you say, just a normal part of life. So if you try, and this is what I see, the pressure on parents and particularly mothers to be nice all the time, to be kind and nice and never do anything in front of the children. And you create a kind of false sort of family. And some of the families I know that I think have the most healthy relationships are ones that shout at each other quite a lot. They're quite volatile in the way that they do so, but they're very honest and they make up and they're very, very close and loving families. So you can't, and then there are other families that or the parents try desperately hard to always present a loving and kind and nice front, and everything's false.
Yeah, well,
and
the issue is
everything's under the surface then, and that I think is very, very confusing and anxiety provoking in children when you can feel the undercurrents as children can, but nobody's saying anything out loud.
Right. Well, that's part of that extended Oedipal complex in some sense, is that the issue is, it's perfectly reasonable for people to work towards having peace in their household. But peace is actually extremely difficult to establish and maintain, because peace means that both of you agree, and also peace means that there's nothing unbelievably complicated facing you at the moment about which you have no idea, and you have no idea how to approach it. If you have a sick child, for example, and you're trying to sort through how to discipline a child like that, let's say, or what medical pathway to walk down, there's no way you can avoid having conflict if you're going to think about it, because it's a very serious issue. And you have to think about it seriously, and that means you have to discuss it. And if you have a different viewpoint, that discussion can get quite heated. But there's no difference between that and thinking that heated discussion. And unless you sort through, say, the complexities on the disciplinary and the medical treatment front, you actually don't have peace, right? You just have a problem. Now, what happens in the families that insist upon presenting this, you might say, gingerbread house world of false peace to their children is that they're pretending constantly that every problem is solved and peace actually reigns, but they're telling the children, often through nonverbal behavior, that any conflict whatsoever is so disruptive and so intolerable that we have to pretend all the time that no conflict whatsoever exists. And so all that does is turn children into creatures that are terrified of their own negative emotions. So they feel that if peace is so necessary and psyche is so fragile that no emotion whatsoever is allowed on the negative side, then any problem must be of terrifying proportions and only something to avoid. And that's definitely a catastrophe for children, especially because they can, especially when they're little, they can be quite volatile, right? If they're tired or hungry or hot or cold and they get volatile, they get upset. And then if they're feeling that they're breaking the eggshells underneath the carpet or rattling the skeletons in the closet, that's just not good for them at all.
Yeah, it teaches children to be afraid of conflict and disagreement and argument, and those are parts of a healthy relationship. You disagree, and I think that when it comes to disciplining disciplining the children, that's an issue that is the adult's job, and it shouldn't be done in front of the children. I mean, it helps if parents share the same values, but often there is a difference between, discipline and attitudes to discipline. This is so common that one parent is more authoritarian and the other parent is more liberal and wants to let the children get away with things more, and the other one wants really tough discipline. And that's so common to a greater or lesser extent. So those sorts of issues really need to be talked about and sorted out by the parents. It's not the child's job to join in with methods of his or her own discipline. That is the parent's job. It's the adult's job, and a child isn't, and then the parent should be able to reach some agreement or compromise and then, proceed. But that shouldn't be part of the child's job. It's not the child's job to,
Yeah, well, you talked about two camps of discipline, Camp A and Camp B. Camp A associated with order, let's say, and integration into the social world, and Camp B associated more, let's say, with chaos and individuation. And that's kind of a conservative liberal split there too. And I suppose that does reflect the fact that children have two problems to solve as they mature, broadly speaking. One is, well, how do I get along with my parents and my siblings and my friends and my teachers, the whole social world? How do I fit in? So that's problem number one. So that means, how do I conduct myself so that people appreciate having me around and I'm a valued social member? And the second problem is, well, how do I stand on my own 2 feet and also become a reliable source of creative individuality and some ability to push back against the mindlessness of the group? And that is an optimization problem. It's very complex, and there's no simple answer to that, partly because it depends on the situation and it depends on the child. And so parents definitely have to negotiate that out. I found with my wife, I'd probably make the first disciplinary move in like 75% of the cases, maybe 60% of the cases in our marriage. I don't think that's that uncommon, because men are more likely to intervene by and large than women are, because they're less agreeable. But I also found, most of the time, although my wife and I were pretty much on the same page with our kids, if I just shut the hell up for 15 seconds when the kids were misbehaving, she would respond. And it was so interesting because her threshold for tolerating misbehavior was not very much different than mine. It was literally, say on average, 15 seconds. But because it was she was reliably somewhat more patient, that did mean that in some circumstances, the bulk of the initial disciplinary moves fell to me. So that's another thing that might be interesting for people to know too. You might be closer than you think on the disciplinary fronts, just one person's a little quicker on the draw than the other. And
again, it's back to...
sorry, please go ahead.
It's back to sharing values, isn't it? If you've got essentially the same values about how you want to bring your child up and how you want your child to be in the world, what your goals are for the way you raise a child, then you can probably work those things out as adults together. And it's not as big.
So we could lay out some of those principles, and I think that'd be useful for people who are watching. So let's take that Camp A and Camp B. We'll start with Camp A, and that would be the more conservative side. Look, it's really important that your children are popular and welcome. And that doesn't mean because they've sold their soul to the group. It means because they can play fair and they're productive and generous and they know how to take turns and they don't whine too much when they lose and they don't triumph too annoyingly when they win. And they're good at reciprocity. They're good play partners. And that's really crucially important to kids. The literature on the development of criminal behavior, antisocial behavior in children shows quite clearly that there's a subset of kids who are quite aggressive at the age of 2. Most of them are boys. Most of them get socialized by the time they're 4. But some of them don't. And the ones that don't start out their sad little social lives as social rejects. And what happens is they fall farther and farther behind because the other kids start to play together because they can stand each other. They start to develop friendships. And within those friendships, they scaffold their social growth. And so what that means is that if your child is unlikable at 4, maybe because you didn't help socialize them sufficiently between you and your wife, then other children will reject them, and then they're really in trouble. And the literature I was familiar with indicated that if your child doesn't make a smooth entry into the social world somewhere between the ages of 3 and 5, there's almost nothing that can be done after that to remediate that. It's such a serious problem. And so one thing that parents could be aiming at is, well, this is why you don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them, because you want other people to welcome them. So they need to be able to modulate their behavior in a socially acceptable way. So that's on the conservative side. On the liberal side, you'd say, well, you don't want your child just to be like a clone of the group. You want them to have some individuality and some autonomy. And so you might have to argue between you about what the balance is between those two things in relationship to your particular child, because it needs to be particularized. But those are good aims. An autonomous child who knows how to play well with others, that's a pretty good deal for the child and for the world and for you as parents.
Yeah, and this is why when I research parent books, parenting advice books, and I think the parenting advice industry doesn't get enough scrutiny. Actually, I'm not a big fan of parenting books, but they tended to be either the kind of quite authoritarian or the quite liberal. And, and in my book, I point out that actually there are good things about both. There are necessary things about both. There's individuation and integration. And, both of those things have. And so you take the bits from each model and you put them together, because both of those are important. And some of those, some of the advice in the more authoritarian books is good. Some of it I don't think is good at all. And the same with the other way. It's important that children are individuals. It's important that we listen to children more than we used to. But what I've seen is it's the liberal parenting side that has come into ascendancy over the last 2 decades. And that runs right across the social spectrum of parents. You get working class parents, middle class parents are very liberal, and I think there's and I think most of the books are on that side, and that creates a huge imbalance in sort of hoping that your child will become a fully rounded human being who feels good about themselves, but also fits into society, but doesn't become a sheep or a cog in the wheel, as you say. So I think we have this huge imbalance for children that doesn't make them happy. And that one of the things that I think is important, if you want that sort of freedom for your child, that you create a structure, and you cannot really have freedom without structure, because that's chaos, right, and that's terrifying for children. And yes. But I think the whole focus is on this idea that children are born whole with a fully formed self, and that it's the parent's job to facilitate expression of that right. self. And I think this. Okay,
so let's dig into that a little bit. So you were concerned in these statements about the tilt towards a more liberal parenting. So the first thing I might comment about that is that being extremely liberal can also be a perfectly valid excuse for neglect, because it actually takes real detailed attention to your children's behavior to help them walk the appropriate social path. And if you're not attending, you let them get away with everything, you can justify that by saying, well, what I'm doing is trying to individuate my child. I don't want to put any social restrictions on them, because that's all hemming in their natural, preformed, perfect creativity. And then you give yourself an easy out. And that's not helpful, partly. And that's partly also being driven by this idiot insistence that self-esteem is only internal and it's only psychological. And that's an unbelievably pathological model of self-esteem. And I would thank the social psychologists for that, mostly. Because a huge amount of what your child would experience, let's say, as self-esteem, which is actually, by the way, technically control of negative emotion, isn't a consequence of the individuated nature of their psyche. It's a consequence of the fact that other people can stand having them around without being mean and rejecting all the time. So if you have a child who knows how to play by the age of 3, let's say, and can share and isn't too whiny and isn't too triumphant and can reciprocate, then you can send them off to daycare, or you can send them off to pre-kindergarten, and they'll make friends. And then when they go to school, they have friends, and the teachers like them. And so they aren't suffering from the kind of negative emotion that people would confuse with low self-esteem. But it's not because, particularly because they're individuated or well-integrated intrapsychically. It's because their behavior is well-regulated socially, and so they integrate well into the community, and so other people don't exclude and torture them. And so we really do have a warped and Rousseauian view of the way that children develop, right? Is they're perfect in and of themselves, except insofar as parents in society impose pathological restrictions on them. And it's, as you said, you pointed out another thing, which is, don't be confusing freedom and chaos. Like, if you give your children carte blanche, all that means is that they're impulsive and anxious. It does not mean they're free. An optimally free child is actually playing a structured game. Now, we know games are fun, but we also know games run by principles. They run by rules. The rules aren't exactly there to constrain and hem in, like you'd think if you were Rousseauian. The rules are actually preconditioned for a very complex sort of freedom. And the basic rules of social interaction, like reciprocity and not whining too much when you lose and not being too triumphant when you win, those are the basic rules of social interaction. And they actually facilitate freedom rather than being antithetical to it.
It's freedom, total freedom without boundaries is terrifying, absolutely terrifying. It is chaos. And for a child, that is terrifying. But the child is always pushing for those boundaries that that they expect. And I think children are born absolutely expecting the adult to know what they're doing, and to guide them. And so they push to find out where that boundary is, and that's the little child's job, really. And if the parent doesn't provide that boundary, then the child has to push further and further and further and come to a place that does not make them happy. It makes them anxious and nervous. So Okay,
so let's segue there then, because I'm going to tell you a little story here, and then you'll see where I'm going with this very quickly. So there's this individual in the Biden administration in Washington, and he's in charge of disposal of all nuclear waste in the U.S., if I remember correctly. Now, he's non-binary by public pronouncement. He's bald, often has a mustache, wears pretty flashy dresses, and has posted a fair bit of his sexual behavior publicly. So you can find pictures of him, for example, splayed out on a slab, bondaged up in rope, all prepared for whatever activity he's prone to engage in. There are pictures of him with men kneeling by his side with dog masks on. Like, he's quite a bit of fun. And so you might say, if you were skeptical, that he's pushing the boundaries. And he keeps pushing them and pushing them. And so far, he hasn't found any boundaries, because not only has he not been stopped in his public display of his impulsive hedonism, let's say, but he's been highly rewarded, because not only was he granted a very plum government position, which he may or may not have been competent enough to occupy, but he also got a tremendous amount of publicity for it. And then you might think, well, that's good enough, he didn't need to encounter any boundaries. He was just pursuing his individuated creativity. But then it turned out a month and a half ago that he stole a suitcase from an airport in Minnesota. And it happened to be a suitcase full of women's clothing. And then he happened to lie about it to the police and said that it was an accident. And he got called out on the carpet pretty hard for that socially, but he didn't get fired because apparently that wasn't pushing the envelope far enough. And so then, you know what? That wasn't good enough for him. He had to go to bloody California and steal another suitcase and get caught. And this time he got fired. And so you talked about this bias towards liberal parenting, let's say, and you put that in the context of children pushing the boundaries, and you put it in the context of anxiety. So let's think of it this way. Children and adults can be overwhelmed by the complexity of the world, and they want a structure, like a game, to hold back that complexity. That's why you need routines in your household. That's why you need predictability in terms of your caretakers. That's why you need rules of the game. It's so that things don't get out of hand. Now, let's say that you adopt an extremely liberal parenting orientation and your children start to push the boundaries. Well, you're not going to stop them. And so that means they're going to push the boundaries harder and harder. And that's going to make them more and more anxious because there's not enough structure. And then let's say they hit teenagehood and puberty. And maybe you're unfortunate. You have a girl who hits puberty a little early and she's a little immature and she's a little sensitive to negative emotion and maybe not quite as popular as she might be. And she's quite confused and anxious and she starts pushing the boundaries pretty damn hard on the gender identity front. And then you've got real trouble, especially if she's also being exposed to a passel of idiot teachers who are doing everything they possibly can to capitalize on her confusion. And so it seems to me that what we are seeing on the gender dysphoria front, which is a form of social contagion and a psychogenic epidemic, is an extension of boundary pushing behavior. It's so a girl can come up to her parent when she's 12 and do a bunch of things at the same time. She can say, well, I think maybe I'm a boy. Okay, so what exactly is going on there? Well, certainly a challenge to